we have to celebrate two astonishing complete translations of one of the purest voices of European and world poetry in the last century, Eugenio Montale. We have to celebrate this event two poets, an actor and an accomplished scholar of Montale. We have Jonathan Galassi, the president and publisher of Farrar Straus Giroux. Galassi graduated from Philip Sexter Academy, where he became interested in poetry, writing, and literature, and from Harvard College in 1971. He is also a translator of poetry and a poet himself. He has translated and published the poetic works of Leopardi and Montale. He was also Marshall Scholar at Christ's College, Cambridge, where he spent 2 years earning a BA in English. He has got several honors. He has been a poetry editor of the Paris Review for 10 years and an honorary chairman of the Academy of American Poets. And he has published extensively also critical essays. We have Fausto Lombardi. Fausto Lombardi attended the National Academy of Dramatic Arts Silvio D'Amico in Rome. Where he still was in the Academy in 1979, he started his acting career playing the role of Umberto Terracini, a famous exponent of Italian politics after the Second World War, in a TV movie, Life of Antonio Gramsci. After that, he played several roles in movie, theaters, and TV. His professional theater debut was with the company The Tree in a theater piece from Gabriele D'Annunzio's novel Il piacere, the pleasure. In 1984, he entered the Strasberg Theater Institute in New York for an extensive period of training that Strasberg needed. Back and forth between USA and Europe, he has been in numerous films, theater shows, and TV movies with several stars. I just will mention some titles. The Sun Also Shine at Night, directed by the Taviani brothers. Lost, directed by Andreas Marfori. Desperate Crimes by Andreas Marfori. Palermo Milan One Way, directed by Claudio Fragasso. And Only You, directed by Norman Jewison. At the moment, he's working with the AE Cinematografica in Spoleto, Italy, writing, directing, and acting in his own production. Rosanna Warren. She's the well-known author of Snow Day, a chapbook of poems, and 4 collections of poems. Each leaf shines separate. Stained Glass, Departure, and Ghost in a Red Hat. She edited and contributed to the art of translation, Voices from the Field, and has edited 3 other chapbooks of poetry by prisoners. She has won several honors, a fellowship from several fellowships from Guggenheim Foundation, ACLS, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, and the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, among others. Stained Glass won the Lamont Poetry Award from the Academy of American Poets. She has won the Bwitter Biner Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the 11 Younger Poets Prize from the Academy of American Poets, and the Award of Merit in Poetry from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2004. She was a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets from 1991 to 2005. Currently, she teaches comparative literature at Boston University. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And then we have Rebecca West, one of the most distinguished She's the William R. Cannon Jr. Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Romance, Languages and Literatures and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago, where she has taught since 1973. Professor West has served as chair in the Department of Romance, Languages and Literatures and as director of the Center for Gender Studies, all at the University of Chicago. She has been visiting professor at a number of famous universities and has got honors including a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, fellowship at the Rockefeller Foundation Study and Conference Center in Bellagio, and at the Liguria Study Center in Bogliasco, Italy. Professor West serves on the editorial boards of several professional journals, Annali d'Italianistica, Italica, Gradiva, Forum Italicum, and The Italianist. She has published over 7 or 8 books and more than 100 articles in her fields of interest, modern and contemporary Italian literature and culture, cinema studies, feminist studies, and has authored one book that I would like to mention is Eugenio Montale, Poet on the Edge, and another one, a very important Cambridge Companion to Modern Italian Culture. Thank you. It is really an honor for me to introduce tonight because we are all convinced that poetry, as once Montale remarked, does not live solely in books or in school anthologies, but lives also in the utterance of the voice. Poetry must be uttered, must be pronounced, word by word, syllable by syllable, because that's the way to really enjoy the poetry and to really start to understand the meaning. Montale again said, I have always knocked at the door of that wonderful and terrible enigma, which is life. I have been judged to be a pessimist, but what abyss of ignorance and low egoism is not hidden in one who thinks that man is the god of himself and that his future can only be triumphant? Thank you.
This is, I just want to preface the reading with a couple of remarks that Rosanna and I, this is not the first time that we've taken Montale on the road, but it's really a wonderful occasion to be able to share and compare translations. Translation is always enriched by comparison, I think, and so it's in the spirit of fun, really, that we're doing this. And I'd also like to point out that there's another great Montalian in the room tonight, the Dutch writer Cees Notenboom, so welcome, Cees. You should be up here too. So I'm supposed to be doing early Montale, which means up through his first 3 books, which took up 2/3 of his life, and the second half of his work was all written in a relatively short period. But I'm going to read a few poems that aren't the ones that are usually read, because there are a lot of Montale chestnuts that some of us know very well, but I thought we'd do a few others tonight. So I'm starting with Eklog. Is that on? Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Eklog. It was good getting lost in the undulant gray of my olives, talkative with bickering birds and singing brooks in the old days. The way the heel sank in the cracked earth among the silver blades of tender leaves, ideas came to mind unorganized in the all too quiet air. Now the blue marbling is gone. The local pine thrusts up to breach the grayness. A patch of sky burns overhead. A spider's web tears at my step. A failed hour unlinks its chain around me. Not far off, the rumble of a train detunnels, swells. A shot crazes the glassy air. A flight pelts like a downpour. Instant, an armful of your bitter husk surges, goes down burned. A pack of unleashed hounds explodes in fury. Soon the idol will be born again. The phase that hangs in the sky gets recomposed. Light streamers slowly unfurl. The thicket of beans vanishes, shrouded in them. Swift wings are no help now, nor bald proposals. Only the solemn cicadas survive the saturnalia of the heat. The image of a woman comes and goes for an instant in a crowd. She disappears. She wasn't a bacchante. Later, a crescent moon. Backtracking from our fruitless wanderings, we could no longer read on the world's face the trace of the frenzy that lasted the afternoon. Uneasily, we scrambled down among the brambles. In my country, this is when the hares begin to hiss.
Perdersi nel bigio ondoso dei miei ulivi era buono nel tempo andato, loquaci di riottanti uccelli e di cantanti rivi. Come affondava il tallone nel suolo screpolato, tra le lamelle d'argento delle esili foglie. Sconnessi nascevano in mente i pensieri nell'aria di troppa quiete. Ora è finito il cerulo marezzo. Si getta il pino domestico a romper la grigiura. Brucia una toppa di cielo. In alto un ragnatelo si squarcia al passo. Si svincola d'attorno un'ora fallita. È uscito un rombo di treno, non lunge, ingrossa. Uno sparo si schiaccia nell'etra vetrino. Strepita un volo come un acquazzone. Venta e vanisce, bruciata, una bracciata di amara tua scorza, istante. Discosta, esplode furibonda una canea. Tosto potrà rinascere l'idillio. Se è ricomposta la fase che pende dal cielo, riescono bende leggere fuori. Il fitto dei fagioli n'è scancellato e involto. Non serve più rapidale, né giova proposito baldo. Non durano che le solenni cicale in questi saturnali del caldo. Va e viene un istante in un folto, una parvenza di donna. È disparsa, non era una baccante. Sul tardi corneggia la luna. Ritornavamo dai nostri vagabondari infruttuosi. Non si leggeva più in faccia al mondo la traccia della frenesia durata il pomeriggio. Turbati, discendevamo tra i vepri. Nei miei paesi, a quell'ora, cominciano a fischiare le lepri.
Delta. The life that breaks apart in secret streams I've linked with you, that argues with itself and almost seems not to know you, suffocated presence. When time chokes at its dikes, you rhyme your fate with its immensity, and surface memory more manifest. Out of the darkness you distended to, as now, after rain, green comes back thick on the branches and red cinnabar on the walls. I know nothing of you but the wordless message that sustains me on my way. If you exist as form or a mirage in the haze of a dream fed by the shore as it rages, eddies, roars against the tide. Nothing of you in the flux of hours, gray or rent by a flash of sulphur, other than the whistle of the tugboat, leaving the mist and making for the Gulf.
La vita che si rompe nei travasi segreti a te ho legata. Quella che si dibatte in sé e par quasi non ti sappia, presenza soffocata. Quando il tempo si ingorga alle sue dighe, la tua vicenda accordi alla sua, immensa, ed a fiori, memoria, più palese dall'oscura regione ove scendevi, come ora al dopo pioggia si riaddensa il verde ai rami, ai muri il cinabrese. Tutto ignoro di te, fuor del messaggio muto che mi sostenta sulla via. Se forma esisti, o ubbia nella fumea d'un sogno t'alimenta la riviera che infebbra, torba e scroscia incontro alla marea. Nulla di te, nel vacillar dell'ore bigie o squarciate da un vampo di solfo, fuori che il fischio del rimorchiatore che dalle brume approda al golfo.
The house of the customs men. You don't recall the house of the customs men on the sheer bluff that overhangs the reef. It's been waiting deserted since the evening your thoughts swarmed in and hovered nervously. Sou'westers have lashed the old walls for years, and your laugh's not carefree anymore. The compass needle staggers crazily, and the dice no longer tell the score. You don't remember. Other times assail your memory. A thread gets wound. I hold one end still, but the house recedes, and the smoke-stained weather vane spins pitiless upon the roof. I hold one end, but you're alone, not here, not breathing in the dark. Oh, the vanishing horizon line, where the tanker's light shines now and then. The channel's here, the breakers still seethe against the cliff that drops away. You don't recall the house of this, my evening, and I don't know who's going or who'll stay.
Tu non ricordi la casa dei doganieri, sul rialzo a strapiombo sulla scogliera. Desolata, t'attende dalla sera in cui v'entrò lo sciame dei tuoi pensieri e vi sostò irrequieto. Libeccio sferza da anni le vecchie mura e il suono del tuo riso non è più lieto. La bussola va impazzita all'avventura e il calcolo dei dadi più non torna. Tu non ricordi. Altro tempo frastorna la tua memoria. Un filo s'addipana. Ne tengo ancora un capo, ma s'allontana la casa e in cima al tetto la banderuola affumicata gira, senza pietà. Ne tengo un capo, ma tu resti sola, né qui respiri nell'oscurità. Ah, l'orizzonte in fuga, dove s'accende rara la luce della petroliera. Il varco è qui, ripulula il frangente ancora sulla balza che scoscende. Tu non ricordi la casa di questa mia sera, ed io non so chi va e chi resta.
Indian Serenade. The raveling of the evenings is ours too, and the stripe of light out of the sea that rises to the park and strikes the aloes. You can take my hand if you pretend to think you're with me, if I'm fool enough to follow you for long, and what you're holding, what you're saying, seems within your power. Were it your life that stalls me at the threshold, and I could lend a face to you, imagine you a form, but no, it's not that way. The octopus that works inky tentacles among the shoals knows how to use you. You belong to him unwittingly. You're him. You think you're you.
È pur nostro il disfarsi delle sere, e per noi è la stria che dal mare sale al parco e ferisce gli aloe. Puoi condurmi per mano se tu fingi di crederti con me, se ho la follia di seguirti lontano e ciò che stringi, ciò che dici, m'appare in tuo potere. Fosse tua vita quella che mi tiene sulle soglie, e potrei prestarti un volto, vaneggiarti figura, ma non è così. Il polipo che insinua tentacoli d'inchiostro tra gli scogli può servirsi di te. Tu gli appartieni e non lo sai. Sei lui, ti credi te.
If they've compared you to the vixen, it will be for your prodigious lope, your darting step that joins and dissevers, that scatters and freshens the gravel, your terrace, the streets by the Cotolengo, the meadow, the tree named after me, all quiver with it, happy, wet, and one. Or maybe simply for the gleaming wave you broadcast from the tender almonds of your eyes, for the shrewdness of your swift astonishments, for the havoc of shredded feathers your baby's hand can wreak with a tug. If they've compared you to a blonde carnivore, the faithful genius of the thicket, and why not the foul fish that shocks the stingray, it may be because the blind had failed to see the wings behind your slender shoulder blades, because the blind had failed to see the omen of your incandescent forehead, the line I've etched in blood there, cross and chrism, charm, calamity, vow, farewell, perdition, and salvation. If they failed to see you as more than weasel or woman, whom will I share my discovery with? Where will I bury the gold I carry, the ember hissing deep in me, if leaving me you turn away from the stairs?
Se t'hanno assomigliato alla volpe, sarà per la falcata prodigiosa, pel volo del tuo passo che unisce e che divide, che sconvolge e rinfranca il selciato, il tuo terrazzo, le strade presso il Cottolengo, il prato, l'albero che ha il mio nome, ne vibravano felici, umidi e vinti. O forse solo per l'onda luminosa che diffondi dalle mandorle tenere degli occhi, per l'astuzia dei tuoi pronti stupori, per lo strazio di piume lacerate che può dare la tua mano d'infante in una stretta. Se t'hanno assomigliato a un carnivoro biondo, al genio perfido delle fratte, e perché non all'immondo pesce che dà la scossa, alla torpedine? È forse perché i ciechi non ti videro sulle scapole gracili le ali, perché i ciechi non videro il presagio della tua fronte incandescente, il solco che vi ho graffiato a sangue, croce cresima, incantesimo, iattura, voto, vale, perdizione e salvezza. Se non seppero crederti più che donnola o che donna, con chi dividerò la mia scoperta? Dove seppellerò l'oro che porto? Dove la brace che in me stride se, lasciandomi, ti volgi dalle scale?
Little Testament. This which flickers at night in the skullcap of my thought, mother of pearl, snail's trace, or mica of crushed glass, isn't light from church or factory fed by red cleric or black. All I can leave you is this rainbow in evidence of a faith that was contested, a hope that burned more slowly than hardwood on the hearth. Keep its powder in your compact until, when every light is out, the sardana becomes infernal, and a shadowy Lucifer sweeps down on a prow, on the Thames, the Hudson, the Seine, flailing his pitch-black wings half-severed from effort to tell you, it's time. It's no inheritance, no talisman to survive the monsoons raging on the spider's thread of memory, but a history lasts only as ashes, and persistence is pure extinction. The sign was right. He who saw it can't fail to find you again. Everyone makes out his own. Pride wasn't flight. Humility wasn't craven. The thin glimmer striking down there wasn't that of a match.
Piccolo testamento. Questo che a notte balugina nella calotta del mio pensiero, traccia madreperlecea di lumaca o smeriglio di vetro calpestato, non è lume di chiesa o d'officina che alimenti chierico, rosso o nero. Solo quest'iride posso lasciarti a testimonianza di una fede che fu combattuta, di una speranza che bruciò più lenta di un duro ceppo nel focolare. Conservane la cipria nello specchietto. Quando spenta ogni lampada, la sardana si farà infernale e un ombroso lucifero scenderà su una prora del Tamigi, dell'Hudson, della Senna, scuotendo l'ali di bitume semimozze dalla fatica a dirti è l'ora. Non è un'eredità, un portafortuna che può reggere all'urto dei monsoni sul fil di ragno della memoria, ma una storia non dura che nella cenere e persistenza è solo l'estinzione. Giusto era il segno. Chi l'ha ravvisato non può fallire nel ritrovarti. Ognuno riconosce i suoi. L'orgoglio non era fuga. L'umiltà non era vile. Il tenue bagliore strofinato laggiù non era quello di un fiammifero.
Now we're moving to the late Montale in the translations by William Arrowsmith. And I would like to thank the Italian Cultural Institute for gathering us here together around this extraordinary poetry, and also the Poetry Society of America and the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics who have co-sponsored the evening. And William Arrowsmith's companion, Marianne Meyer, is here tonight, and I would like to thank you, Marianne, for being here, along with Bill's ghost. My Muse. My muse is distant. One might say, and most have thought it, that she never existed. But if she was my muse, she's dressed like a scarecrow awkwardly propped on a checkerboard of vines. She flaps as best she can. She's withstood monsoons without falling, though she sags a little. When the wind dies, she keeps on fluttering, as though telling me, "Go on, don't be afraid. As long as I can see you, I'll give you life." My muse long since left a storeroom full of theatrical outfits, and an actor costumed by her was an actor with class. Once she was filled with me, and she walked proud and tall. She still has one sleeve, with which she conducts her scrannel straw quartet. It's the only music I can stand.
La mia musa. La mia musa è lontana. Si direbbe è il pensiero dei più, che mai sia esistita. Seppure uno ne fu, indossa i panni dello spaventacchio, alzato a malapena su una scacchiera di viti. Sventola come può, ha resistito a monsoni, restando ritta, solo un po' ingobbita. Se il vento cala, sa agitarsi ancora, quasi a dirmi: cammina, non temere, finché potrò vederti ti darò vita. La mia musa ha lasciato da tempo un ripostiglio di sartoria teatrale, ed era d'alto bordo chi di lei si vestiva. Un giorno fu riempita di me e ne andò fiera. Ora ha ancora una manica e con quella dirige un suo quartetto di cannucce. È la sola musica che sopporto.
Poor art. The painting on the easel demands sacrifice from the painter, even more from the man who buys it and hasn't a clue where to hang it. For several years, all I painted was bird traps, birds snared in paper bags, blue sugar boxes or tubes of wrapping paper. If the background was a white-capped sea, my colors were wine, coffee, and flecks of toothpaste. I also composed with ashes and cappuccino dregs at Sainte-Adresse, the place where Jonquind found his icy light, and my package was protected by cellophane and camphor with no great success. It's this part of me that manages to survive the nothingness that was in me, the hole that you, unwittingly, were.
L'arte povera. La pittura da cavalletto costa sacrifici a chi la fa ed è sempre un sovrappiù per chi la compra e non sa dove appenderla. Per qualche anno ho dipinto solo roccoli con uccelli insaccati, su carta blu da zucchero o cannelé da imballo, vino e caffè, tracce di dentifricio se in fondo c'era un mare infiocchettabile, queste le tinte. Composi anche con cenere e con fondi di cappuccino a Sainte-Adresse, laddove Jonquind trovò le sue gelide luci, e il pacco fu protetto da cellophane e canfora, con scarso esito. È la parte di me che riesce a sopravvivere del nulla che era in me, del tutto che eri tu, inconsapevole.
In an Italian garden. Since one of his hind legs was cut off, the old turtle walks with a lurch. When a lush green lawn starts to quiver, it's the turtle limping invisibly through clover geometries back to his shelter. How long has he been lame? On this point, gardener and owner are both uncertain. 50 years or more, or earlier still, back in the days of General Pelou. To the tortoise, all ages are one, all lesions contemporary.
In un giardino italiano. La vecchia tartaruga cammina male, beccheggia, perché le fu troncata una zampetta anteriore. Quando un verde mantello entra in agitazione, è lei che arranca invisibile in geometrie di trifogli e torna al suo rifugio. Da quanti anni? Qui restano incerti giardiniere e padrone. Mezzo secolo o più. O si dovrà risalire al generale Pelou? Non c'è un'età per lei. Tutti gli strappi sono contemporanei.
Fire and darkness. At times, because of dampness, gunpowder fails to flash and sometimes catches without matches or flint. A pocket lighter with one drop of fluid could do the trick. And anyway, there's no need for fire at all. Indeed, a good sub-zero curbs that boring great-grandmother inspiration. She was none too spry a few days ago, but she managed to disguise her wrinkles. Now, ashamed of herself, she seems to be skulking in the folds of the curtain. She's lied too often. Now let darkness, void, nothingness fall on her page. Rely on this, my scribbling friend. Trust the darkness when the light lies.
Il fuoco e il buio. Qualche volta la polvere da sparo non prende fuoco per l'umidità. Altre volte s'accende senza il fiammifero o l'acciarino. Basterebbe il tascabile brick se ci fosse una goccia di benzina. E infine non occorre fuoco affatto, anzi, un buon sottozero tiene a freno la tediosa bisava d'ispirazione. Non era troppo arzilla giorni fa, ma incerottava bene le sue rughe. Ora pare nascosta tra le pieghe della tenda e ha vergogna di se stessa. Troppe volte ha mentito Ora può scendere sulla pagina il buio, il vuoto, il niente. Di questo puoi fidarti, amico scriba. Puoi credere nel buio quando la luce mente.
Unanswered questions. They ask me if I've written a canzoniere of love poems and whether my only begetter is one or many. Alas, my head's confused with all the figures compounding there, making one woman whom I dimly discern in my twilight blur. Had I the obligatory lute of a more accessible troubadour, there would be no problem in giving a name to that she who possessed my poetic heart or whatever. If names were a consequence of things, I couldn't cite you one, since things are facts, and in perspective, facts are little more than ashes. Unfortunately, all I had was words, things that approximate but don't touch. And so, there is no recipient of my heart who isn't in her grave. Whether her name was one or many matters not at all to a man who remained, however briefly, outside divine inexistence. À bientôt, my beloved ghosts.
Domande senza risposta. Mi chiedono se ho scritto un canzoniere d'amore e se il mio only begetter è uno solo o è molteplice. Ahimè. La mia testa è confusa. Molte figure vi si addizionano. Ne formano una sola che discerno a malapena nel mio crepuscolo. Se avessi posseduto un liuto come d'obbligo per un trobar meno chiuso, non sarebbe difficile dare un nome a colei che ha posseduto la mia testa poetica, o altro ancora. Se il nome fosse una conseguenza delle cose, di queste non potrei dirne una sola, perché le cose sono fatti, e i fatti, in prospettiva, sono appena cenere. Non ho avuto purtroppo che la parola, qualche cosa che approssima, ma non tocca. E così non c'è depositaria del mio cuore che non sia nella bara. Se il suo nome fosse un nome o più nomi, non conta nulla per chi è rimasto fuori, ma per poco, della divina inesistenza. A presto, adorate mie larve.
Protect me. Protect me, my silent guardians. The sun is getting cold, and the last leaf of laurel was too dusty, useless even for the pot roast. Protect me from this two-bit film being projected non-stop before my eyes, which presumes to involve me as an actor or extra unforeseen by the script. Protect me even from your own presence, almost always useless and untimely. Protect me from your frightening absences, from the void you create around me. Protect me from the muses I saw roosting or shrunk to half busts so they could better hide from my spectral step. Protect me, or better yet, ignore me when they put me in the grave I've been purchasing for years. Protect me from the fame farce that got me into the illustrated Larousse only to be evicted from the latest edition. Protect me from those who implore your residence around my catafalque. Protect me with your oblivion, if that would prevent me from falling. Poor household gods, sealed always in your dubious identity. Protect me without anyone's knowing about it, since the sun is getting cold, and those who know it are malevolently pleased. Oh, my little gods.
Proteggetemi. Proteggetemi, custodi miei silenziosi, perché il sole si raffredda e l'ultima foglia dell'alloro era polverosa e non servì nemmeno per la casseruola dell'arrosto. Proteggetemi da questa pellicola da 4 soldi che continua a svolgersi davanti a me e pretende di coinvolgermi come attore o comparsa non prevista dal copione. Proteggetemi persino dalla vostra presenza, quasi sempre inutile e intempestiva. Proteggetemi dalle vostre spaventose assenze, dal vuoto che create attorno a me. Proteggetemi dalle muse che vidi appollaiate o anche dimezzate a mezzo busto per nascondersi meglio dal mio passo di fantasma. Proteggetemi, o meglio ancora, ignoratemi quando entrerò nell'oculo che ho già pagato da anni. Proteggetemi dalla fama farsa che mi ha introdotto nella Rus illustrato, per scancellarmi poi dalla nuova edizione. Proteggetemi da chi impetra la vostra permanenza attorno al mio catafalco. Proteggetemi con la vostra dimenticanza, se questo può servire a tenermi in piedi, poveri lari, sempre chiusi nella vostra dubbiosa identità. Proteggetemi senza che nessuno ne sia informato, perché il sole si raffredda e chi lo sa malvagiamente se ne rallegra, o miei piccoli nomi, divinità di terz'ordine scacciate dall'etere.
So we're going to do Dora Markus in 2 versions, and Fausto, if you read it in between, I think that would...
In between?
Yes. Okay. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Okay. We're going to start with the Arrowsmith Dora Markus, and then we will have Jonathan Galassi's Dora Markus. So since you have these 2 packets to negotiate. So this is the Arrowsmith Dora Markus, so that you can hear 2 major translators wrestling with the same Italian poem. Dora Markus. 1. It was where the wooden bridge runs to Porto Corsini over open water, and a few men, moving slowly, sink their nets or haul them in. With a wave of your hand you pointed toward the invisible shore beyond, your true fatherland. Then we followed the canal back to the city's inner harbor, shining with soot, in the wet flats, where a sluggish springtime was settling down, unremembering. And here, where an ancient life is mottled with a sweet oriental yearning, your words shimmered like the scales of a dying mullet. Your restlessness reminds me of those migratory birds that thump against the lighthouse on stormy nights. Even your sweetness is a storm whose raging's unseen, whose lulls are even rarer. I don't know how, in extremis, you resist in that lake of indifference that is your heart. Perhaps some amulet preserves you, some keepsake beside your lipstick, powder puff or file, a white mouse of ivory. And so, you persist. 2. Now in your Corinthia of flowering myrtles and ponds leaning over the edge, you look down at the shy carp gaping, or under the lime trees follow the evening star kindling along the jagged peaks and the water aflame with awnings on lodging houses and piers. The night that reaches out over the damp inlet brings, mingled with throbbing motors, only the honking of geese, and an interior of snow-white tiles tells the blackened mirror that sees the change in you a tale of errors calmly accepted, etching it in where the sponge won't reach. Your legend, Dora, but it's written already in the stares of men with scraggly whiskers, dignified in great gilded portraits, returning in every chord sounded by the broken street organ in the darkening hour, always later. It's written there. The evergreen bays for the kitchen resist. The voice doesn't change. Ravenna's far away. A brutal faith distills its venom. What does it want from you? Voice, legend, or fate can't be surrendered. But it's getting late. Always later.
Dora Markus. 1. Fu dove il ponte di legno mette a Porto Corsini sul mare alto e rari uomini, quasi immoti, affondano o salpano le reti. Con un segno della mano additavi all'altra sponda, invisibile, la tua patria vera. Poi seguimmo il canale fino alla darsena della città lucida di fuliggine, nella bassura dove s'affondava una primavera inerte, senza memoria. E qui, dove un'antica vita si screzia in un dolce ansietà di Oriente, le tue parole iridavano come le scaglie della triglia moribonda. La tua irrequietudine mi fa pensare agli uccelli di passo che urtano ai fari nelle sere tempestose. È una tempesta anche la tua dolcezza. Turbina e non appare. E i suoi riposi sono anche più rari. Non so come stremata tu resisti in quel lago di indifferenza che è il tuo cuore. Forse ti salva un amuleto che tu tieni vicino alla matita delle labbra, al piumino, alla lima. Un topo bianco, d'avorio. E così esisti. 2. Ormai nella tua carinzia di mirti fioriti e di stagni, china sul bordo sorvegli la carpa che timida a bocca, o segui sui tigli, tra gli irti pinnacoli, le accensioni del vespro e nell'acque un avvampo di tende da scali e pensioni. La sera, che si protende sull'umida conca, non porta col palpito dei motori che gemiti d'oche, e un interno di nivee maioliche dice allo specchio annerito che ti vide diversa una storia di errori imperturbati e la incide dove la spugna non giunge. La tua leggenda, Dora, ma è scritta già in quegli sguardi di uomini che hanno fedine altere e deboli, in grandi ritratti d'oro, e ritorna ad ogni accordo che esprime l'armonica guasta nell'ora che abbuia, sempre più tardi. È scritta là. Il sempreverde all'oro per la cucina resiste, la voce non muta. Ravenna è lontana, distilla veleno, una fede feroce. Che vuole da te? Non si cede voce, leggenda o destino, ma è tardi, sempre più tardi.
Dora Markus, 1. It was where the wooden bridge spans the high tide at Porto Corsini, and a few men, almost motionless, sink or haul in their nets. With the motion of a hand you signaled your true country on the other invisible shore. Then we followed the canal to the city dock, bright with soot, in the lowland where a listless spring, devoid of memory, was sinking. And here, where an ancient life diffracts in a gentle oriental anxiousness, your words were iridescent like the scales of a dying mullet. Your restlessness reminds me of those migrant birds that hurl themselves at lighthouse beams on stormy nights. Your sweetness is a storm as well. It clouds up and won't show itself. Its periods of rest are rarer still. I don't know how you hold on, spent in the lake of indifference your heart is. Maybe what saves you is an amulet you keep with your lipstick, powder, file, a white ivory mouse, and so you live. 2. Now in your Corinthia of flowering myrtle and ponds, you lean at the rim and watch the timid carp gasp, or follow over the lime trees between the steep eaves, dusk lighting up, and on the water a flaring of curtains from pensions and docks. The evening that stretches out on the wet bay only brings the wail of geese with a motor's throb, and a snow-white majolica interior tells the darkening mirror that sees you different, a tale of unperturbed wandering, etching it where the eraser can't reach. Your legend, Dora, but it's written already in the stares of men with proud, thin whiskers in heavy gold frames, and echoes in every chord the broken spinet emits as night falls, later every evening. It's written there, the evergreen laurel for the kitchen lasts, the voice won't change, Ravenna's far, a savage faith distills its venom. What does it want from you? Voice, legend, destiny, nothing's surrendered, but it's late. Always later and later.
First, I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation to come to New York and to be with my old friends and co-montalisti. Just a few thoughts to try to open out some aspects of the poetry that we've heard tonight and maybe to provide some stimulation for your comments and questions. Can you all hear me okay? Montale himself commented on his unexpected later collections of poetry, which, as we know, appeared several years after the last of the earlier trilogy of collections, which was La bufera e altro, The Storm and Other Things, of 1956. Satura, the first of the next unexpected later volumes, had been published in 1962 in a private limited edition. Then Xenia, poems to his wife, Mosca, also appeared as a limited private edition in 1966. But both of these did not appear in a collection for a broader audience until 1971. So essentially from 56 to 71, for the general public, readers of Montale, there was silence. In a 1977 interview, Montale stated, quote, "Some poems of Satura, like the Arno et Rovezzano, could also figure in La bufera. But then there is the intermezzo of Xenia, then a part that is newer, more aphoristic. The first 3 books are written in a tuxedo, the others in pajamas, or let's say in afternoon clothes. In the last collections, there are recoveries from the first ones, just as there are themes, motifs, and characters from The Butterfly of Dinard, which was a collection of his prose writings." This is still Montale. "The accent, voice, and intonation are changed." End of quote. Montale further underlined the attenuation of his poetic voice in these later poems with words such as the other side of the coin, or the back of the shop, the retrobottega. And he talked of having written first the recto and then the verso, the front side, the back side. The poems in Satura and beyond are certainly more quotidian, occasional, and, as Montale himself states, aphoristic. They are also, in great part, poems that implicitly or overtly comment on his own earlier poetry, the verse of the so-called high season of cuttlefish bones, the occasions, and the storm and other things. But I think we would be wrong if we see the later verse as simply more transparently autobiographical or straightforwardly palinodic vis-a-vis his early collections. Montale provides us with a clue as to how we should read the later poems when he states, quote, "It would be an error to read one poem only and to seek to dissect it, because there's always a cross-reference from one sound to another, and not only this, but even from one poem to another." End of quote. As the poet so beautifully said of Dante's Divine Comedy, in words that apply to his own poetry, I think, there is what Montale called in Dante a huge web of correspondences that is spun and ultimately forms the pattern of the whole. We know that Montale delighted in leading his critics down paths that were not necessarily straight and well lit. His word for this was depistati, or sidetracked, I critici depistati. But I'm convinced that his comments that I've just read on his later poetry are fairly straightforward and are pretty good signposts for us as we make our way through Satura, the Diari, and Quaderno di Quattro Anni, and of course beyond to Altri Versi and so on. One of the most marvelous things about having William Arrowsmith's translations gathered into one volume now is precisely the possibility for English language readers to trace out those cross-references in the later poetry and to hear that huge web of correspondences. This comes with private reading. For a public reading of some few chosen poems, although it can give us another kind of pleasure, such as we enjoyed here tonight, cannot give us this sense of overarching patterns, but it can give us another kind of pleasure and insight into the poetry. And this pleasure and insight have to do with the masterly control and shaping of each and every poem in Montale's great corpus, from the very beginning to the end. It's true that some of the later poems could be called minor when compared to the astonishing single and collective excellence of the earlier poems. Tonight, for example, Dora Markus, or La Casa, doganieri, or Piccolo Testamento are examples of the heights that were reached in his earlier major volumes. But in the later volumes, we seldom perceive a slackening of the poet's talents. And more often, in fact, we're amazed by the power and originality and quality of surprise of the poems written in Montale's so-called waning years of life and work. That the poet himself was aware that his age played a role in the critical responses towards him and his work in his later years is clear. When I met him in 1976 and 1977, precisely around the time when Satura was newly on the scene and the poems of the subsequent collections were already being written, he told me that he was a mummia, a mummy, nicely embalmed in the critical readings that had grown up around his early trilogy. And he very obviously delighted in rising up out of his tomb to surprise those who thought him and his work a done deal. The poet stated in 1977, referring to himself in the third person, quote, "If the poet Montale had died, no one would have spoken of an untimely demise. But he did not die, and when he began again to write verse after many years of prose, the need to show the envers du décor inexorably prevailed upon him." I hear the delight in his words, "but he did not die." Montale was a trickster, delighting in little jokes and games, and it is as if his own persistence in life and in his new poetry were one of his little jokes or games. His final joke, much contested, but nonetheless surely in keeping with his penchant for such things, was poetry that he left to Annalisa Cima, a companion of his last years and a poet in her own right, with instructions that it be published bit by bit only after his demise. I say contested because there were many critics who did not believe that Montale wrote these poems, which were judged to be quite inferior to his usual production. But Cima, in fact, followed his instructions and produced beautiful editions with 6 poems in each over a period of several years after Montale's death. That he had such a playful, even mischievous side may be difficult to discern in much of his poetry, which is so often somber, expressive of deep pain and loss, harsh in its assessment of the modern world and its strife and idiocy. But I remember well when, as we chatted in his apartment on Via Bigli in Milan, he picked up a huge, heavy tome on some ponderous philosophical topic and said to me, "This is an extremely useful book." I breathlessly waited to hear why this was so, pen poised over my notebook, and he continued, "It works extremely well in a pinch to press out wrinkles in my trousers." An almost boyish chuckle followed as he watched my face change from intent to confused to finally smiling. So the poet had a playful side, but he was also one of those souls that seem to have been born old, with that intense awareness of the fleeting nature of happiness and the brevity of life. Like Italo Svevo, the Triestine writer whom he championed, and who himself wrote a novel entitled Senilità, translated as a Man Grows Older, Montale was a senex from his earliest years, an old soul, referring to himself as a fanciullo antico, an ancient boy, in one of his very first poems, Riviere, Seacoast, which dates from 1920 when he was only 24 years old. He figured himself in various poetic alter egos as someone on the sidelines of life, earthbound, unable to escape the bell jar of existential imprisonment, while to others, especially his beloved lady Clizia, he gave the power of escape, transcendence, winged perceptions of the meaning of it all. This brings me to essentially my last topic of tonight, which is centered on his poetic ladies. Montale is indeed a great love poet, although his love poetry is not by any means filled with the standard tropes and metaphors of romantic enthrallment. His major beloveds are standardly indicated as Clizia and La Volpe, or the Vixen. The first, a poetic evocation and refashioning of Irma Brandeis, with whom he had an intense affair in the 1930s, until the impending war meant that the Jewish Irma had to leave Europe for her own safety. We now have his letters to her, in which the stormy relationship is painfully traced. And the second, the Vixen, was inspired by the poet Maria Luisa Spaziani, who's often glossed as the more erotic physical counterpoint to Clizia's ethereal and angelic essence. There are other poetic ladies, including Dora Markus, the poem for whom was inspired by a photograph of her beautiful legs sent to Montale by his friend Bobby Blaslin. And there was Liuba and Gerti and Anna Arletta, and of course Mosca. Drusilla Tanzi was her real name, the poet's longtime companion and eventual wife. Of course, Dora Markus, Gerti, Liuba, and so on make only single appearances in the poems about them, while Clizia, La Volpe, and Annetta Arletta have been shown appear constantly throughout the poetry. And the last, Annetta or Arletta, has been shown to be a fairly constant presence even from the most early poems, a kind of submerged presence absence. Montale associated both Clizia and the Vixen with odd animals, and he talks of the two jackals on a leash in the motet la speranza di pure rivederti, the hope of ever seeing you again. He calls these jackals on a leash a possible sign or glimmer of Clizia. The great poem L'Anguilla, the eel, is one of the most original love poems ever, to my mind. The beloved is turned into an eel, who is a spark, a rainbow, a green soul, who overcomes desolation in order to reach Edens of generation. And in the poem that Jonathan read, Se t'hanno assomigliato, if they've likened you, the beloved is compared to a vixen, a stingray, a weasel. Clizia truly emerges in the second collection, Le Occasioni, a volume discreetly dedicated to her with a simple dedication, A-I-B, to I-B, marking Irma Brandeis as inspiration long before her identity became generally known. I should add, much to her dismay, as I learned in some correspondence with her many years ago. She was a very private person and wanted their private relationship to remain private, but alas, it did not. These women were surely muses for the poet, but they were also very real sources of support. Irma Brandeis published translations of a few of Montale's poems in the U.S. quite early on in his career. She was among the very first people who were translating Montale into English. And she tried very hard to make it possible for him to come to the United States as a professor at some American college or university when he was during and shortly after the war years was attempting to make this change. She never stopped praising the excellence of his poetry even after they had parted, in what had to be a time of bitter disappointment for Irma at Montale's final inability to leave Mosca and Italy. Maria Luisa Spaziani, herself a highly accomplished poet, read Montale's works in progress and commented on them, gave him a tremendous amount of feedback on his works in progress, and as a scholar of French literature, she gave him many insights into French symbolism and other essential aspects of the French poetic tradition. So these were intellectual women, accomplished women, who gave as good as they took in terms of literary exchanges of real importance to Montale. Brandeis wrote a book on Dante's Divine Comedy called The Ladder of Vision, for example, and it was very highly valued by Montale. Himself, of course, a great admirer of the great poet, from whom he took the model of the beloved lady, Beatrice, to help to shape his own version, Clizia. Montale wrote once that compared to Dante, there are no other poets. Both Clizia and the Vixen were what I have called elsewhere stylistic adventures, as well as actual beloved women in his life, and they provided him with much real, very real support and intellectual stimulation in his life, but also fuel for many of his greatest poems. If Montale liked to suggest that Clizia was his Beatrice and the Vixen was Petra, or his stony lady, alluding to Dante's series of early verse known as the Rime Petrose, or the Stony Rhymes, the neat division between the angelic transcendent Clizia and the erotic Vixen does not really hold up in his poetry. Both of them, in their incarnations in poetry, have a transcendent quality, and both have a strong erotic charge. Clizia, whose presence in his poetry is more sustained, is in fact a hybrid, both ethereal and lovely, and also tough as nails, strong as steel, clear-sighted, and in charge of her own destiny. In a recent essay entitled Wives and Lovers in Dante and Montale, I elaborate this idea that these poetic beloveds are very complex, hybrid figures, rather than static, passive figures, as sometimes the earlier glossing of his poetry seemed to suggest. And I also talk a bit about the issue of wives as poetic inspiration. In Dante, it's well known that he never mentions his wife, Gemma, anywhere in his great poem, or in any of his other works for that matter. But he does at least mention a wife, the wife of his great poet friend Forese Donati, whom Dante had maligned terribly in a poetic exchange, or tensone, with Forese years before the comedy was written. It's a scatological exchange in which he has very nasty things to say about Forese's wife. However, in the Divine Comedy, years later, when he meets up with Forese in Purgatory, he has Forese evoke his wife. And the words are, La vedovella mia che molto amai, my dear little widow, whom I so loved. This is a wonderful palinodic moment that implicitly apologizes for the scatological verses about her that he had written as a young man. Montale, instead, does write a series of poems to and about his wife, Mosca, the Xenia poems that were first published in the private run and then incorporated into the 1971 volume, Satura. So few modern poets seem to wish to use their wives as inspiration for their poetic ladies. They're usually, I mean, that's continuing, of course, the courtly love tradition, where you don't talk about your legal spouse. You talk about the unreachable other woman. So few modern poets use their wives as inspiration, and we're all the more struck, I think, by this series of poems to Mosca, the wife with such bad eyesight that her thick glasses greatly magnified her eyes, making them appear insect-like, and thus led to her nickname, the fly, Mosca. These poems are among the greatest evocations, I think, in the modern lyric tradition of the meaning and depth of long companionship, the domestic rituals that make up shared lives, the sense of unspeakable loss when one of the pair dies, the, as Montale says, wanting you back, if only in one gesture, one little habit of yours. The poems are also palinodic, as Dante's words about Forese's wife are in the comedy. For the Mosca, who is written about in the Xenia series, is very beloved, while the Mosca of the letters to Irma Brandeis is a neurotic shrew whose grasping behavior sends the poet into utter fits of despair. So I think we have a kind of similar rethinking, at least poetically, of the meaning of Mosca in Montale's life and art. Finally, just to talk a bit about Montale's ghosts. The beloved people he had lost to distance, time, and death. From his early evocation of his mother and father and of his friend Fadin, whom Montale characterizes as having daily decency, one of the highest of qualities in Montale's estimation, to his losing of Clizia across the ocean, to his more quotidian evocations of the dead Mosca, we feel strongly that he was bound to absent ones. As we heard tonight in the poem Questions Without Answers, he calls them adorate mie larvae, my beloved ghosts. And in one of the Mosca poems, he calls them ombre, a most Dantesque word that Dante used to describe his ombre, or shades, that he met in the afterlife. The Mosca poem in which this term ombre appears is about her brother who died young. And the poet writes, quote, after you, I was the only one left for whom he ever existed. But we can love a shade, you know, being shades ourselves. Possiamo amare le ombre, sai, noi ombre stesse. Montale felt himself with and among these lost loved ones long before he actually died. Thus, we see something of the contradiction or the oxymoronic essence of so much of Montale's thought and verse. There's a tenacious persistence in living, and persistenza is one of Montale's favorite poetic terms, and in continuing also to write poetry. As he triumphantly said of his final season, he didn't die. Alongside a deep-rooted feeling of already being out of the game of life and in the realm of larve and ombre. Montale was not a conventionally religious poet or man, but he expressed a strong hope for some signs of transcendence and immanence throughout his poetry. He sought the incarnated God who might reveal itself in flashes and glimmers here in this life. And for me, one of his most beautiful late poems is L'Angelo Nero, the Black Angel, to whom he prays, this small, dark angel who is neither heavenly nor human, angel who shines through, changing colors, formless and multiform, equal and unequal in the swift lightning of your incomprehensible fabulation. And I wondered if possibly I could just, as a special request, ask that you read L'Angelo Nero.
Angel, shelter me under your wings. Let me scrape past the bramble spikes, the oven's shining jets, and fall to my knees on the dead embers if perchance some fringe of your feathers remains. O small dark angel, neither heavenly nor human, angel who shines through, changing colors, formless and multiform, equal and unequal in the swift lightning of your incomprehensible fabulation. O black angel, reveal yourself, but may your splendor not consume me. Leave unmelted in the mist that halos you. Stamp yourself in my thought, since no eye resists your blazings, coal-black angel, sheltering under the chestnut peddler's cape. Great ebony angel, angel dusky or white, if weary of my wandering, I clutched your wing and felt it crunch. I could not know you as now I do, in sleep, on waking, in the morning, since between true and false no needle can stop biped or camel, and the charred residue, the grime left on the fingertips, is less than the dust of your last feather, great angel of ash and smoke, mini angel, chimney sweep.
L'Angelo Nero. O grande angelo nero, fuligginoso, riparami sotto le tue ali, che io possa sorradere i pettini dei pruni, le luminarie dei forni, e inginocchiarmi sui tizi spenti, se mai vi resti qualche frangia delle tue penne. O piccolo angelo buio, non celestiale né umano, angelo che traspari trascolorante difforme e multiforme, eguale e ineguale nel rapido lampeggio della tua incomprensibile fabulazione. O angelo nero, disvelati, ma non uccidermi col tuo fulgore, non dissipare la nebbia che ti aureola, stampati nel mio pensiero, perché non c'è occhio che resista ai fari. Angelo di carbone, che ti ripari dentro lo scialle della calda arrostaia. Grande angelo d'ebano, angelo fosco o bianco, stanco di errare, se ti prendessi un'ala e la sentissi scricchiolare, non potrei riconoscerti come faccio nel sonno, nella veglia, nel mattino, perché tra il vero e il falso non una cruna può trattenere il bipede o il cammello, e il bruciaticcio, il grumo, che resta sui polpastrelli. È meno dello spolvero dell'ultima tua piuma, grande angelo, di cenere e di fumo. Mini angelo, spazzacamino.
And now we're hoping to have a conversation with you. We designed the evening for that, and we hope you'll ask questions and make comments, and we have a good half hour in which to do this. We were particularly interested in designing the evening in the astonishing evolution of Montale as a poet. So we gave you a great sweep of his creations from early to very, very late.
Well, I have a question. Would any of you apply to Montale's late poems the concept of late style as defined by Adorno and Edward Said?
Okay.
Well, it's a difficult issue in that I think that there is tremendous newness in the late poetry. You know, clearly there's this great break. I mean, it was really shocking when Sartre came out, and you know, critics' response to it was, "Wait a minute, you know, what has happened to our Montale?" And yet, there's also this tremendous continuity. You know, there's this kind of sense of referring back and rethinking his own poetry up to that point, and bringing out old themes and concepts, and even the use of language refers us back. So I don't know. I mean, it's certainly new and departing from the earlier so-called higher poetry, but yet I see so many continuities that it's difficult for me to decide in one direction or the other.
I would say that Rosanna writes in her introduction to the Arrowsmith book that how important prose was for Montale, that he was always using prose as a corrective to the excesses of poeticity of Italian. And I think that in his later work, he's much more prosaic, much more lyrical in his rhetoric, though his later poetry is still very tense and poetic in language, I think. But it appears more prosaic, and I also think he was one of the influences on Montale's late work is Robert Lowell's sonnets that he wrote, which are much more daily and he himself was trying to be anti-lyrical, and I think that was certainly do you agree?
Yes, I would agree. But one of the challenges for me in thinking about the later Montale is, and I don't personally think about him so much in terms of Said's ideas about late style, but it's to do with this question of prose, and because it's a radical challenge to what you think poetry is. If you call a poem prosaic, what are you saying? And that's, to me, such an exciting, fundamental question that throws you back on your heels and makes you say, well, what do I think poetry is? And what distinguishes poetry from prose? And I love the late Montale because he takes you by the throat, or at least he takes me by the throat, and he makes me rethink what I thought poetry was. So, Jonathan, you were just invited that. By now, you're saying it's prosaic, but it's not prose. It's still, quote, poetic. Well, what is poetic about it? If you notice that ashes appeared in almost all these poems. I think he's a great poet of ashes, but that means he's also a great poet of fire. But if you've burned away rhyme and you've burned away meter, the endecasillabo and other standard Italian meters, and you burned away a lot of figurative language, and you burned away the more overt and luscious assonance and alliteration and sound play of the ossi di seppia and even the occasioni, what do you have left? And it's made me rack my brains to think, well, what do we have? What makes these late poems so thrilling? And I think it's partly architecture and a poetry of syntax. And if you look carefully, I began my old Latin studies. I began to think, oh, he's doing all these Latin Ciceronian things. He's really building them he's pretending to be writing a diary or a little newspaper article, an op-ed piece, but he's really building them with chiasmus and all sorts of quite complicated rhetorical figures, but they're disguised, and they're very contracted, actually. That would be one way that's one way I've tried to explain to myself what makes these poems. What's the formal principle? Because they don't appear to have a formal principle. They seem to be an old man yammering.
They're not very metaphorical, though.
No, they're not. I said that he burned away figurative language, I think. He burns away metaphor and simile in their more obvious manifestations, so they seem to come in back through the back door. But anyway, I'm talking too much. We really want to hear more from you.
I would just say also to add to that one of the things that I think we should take very seriously is his own suggestion that we listen to these ways in which the poems bounce off each other,
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
You know, I think a good part of this project, if we want to think of it as a different new project in his later years, is precisely that. You know, it's the order of the poems. Mm-hmm. It's the structure of the volumes themselves, which were, you know, presented as the most casual of forms. The notebook, the diary, satura, which means miscellaneous collection, something like that. And yet these are really structured volumes that have a lot to do with that idea of internal counter,
Yes.
connections that go on throughout. Yeah.
What amazes me about Montale, and which I can see as horrendous problems of translation, is a kind of controlled sweet madness that Stevens has sometimes. And it just knocks me for a loop.
Yeah.
And I just think how you translated it also. I mean, there was, you spoke of the ashes, but then there's the dregs of cappuccino.
Yes. Right. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Controlled sweet madness. Yes, that's a great phrase. From early to late, too. That's one of the continuities, I think, that Rebecca was talking about. One of the challenges of looking at Montale from the early poems all the way through to the end is a kind of warp and woof. There are radical changes, but there are deep continuities, and trying to sort those out in your mind is quite an exercise. No other challenges? Man, there's a hand.
Do you feel that the burning away of poeticisms on the one hand and the more quotidian casual language on the other hand make his later work more or less earthbound than the earlier work? I mean, do the ashes rise and fly away, or is it more tied to the daily?
I don't think his later poems are more casual. They're more ironic, I think. And but his use of language is very clipped and precise, and as it always was. His word choice is always very surprising, and I think he may not use traditional rhythms, but rhythmic tension is always there in the lines. So I think they are incredibly poetic in their tensile strength, I guess. I don't know if that's not an answer to your question.
But in terms of whether the image of the ashes and when the burning away, whether there's a grandeur or some kind of ascension in that, or just reduction, it seems to me that the poem with which Rebecca concluded, the Black Angel, L'Angelo Nero, is a perfect answer to your wonderful question, because that's a poem of diminishment. It's a poem about a little angel, spazzacamino, a little chimney sweep, but he's enormous, this angel. He becomes enormous in the course of the poem. And so I think that the late Montale is a great artist of diminishment. And we could think of other poets of great 20th century poets of diminishment, like some part of Wallace Stevens, nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. Some of Frost, his great poetry of diminishment, what to make of a diminished thing. And it seems to me that Montale is making something grand and terrifying in his late poems, out of diminishment, the recognition of diminishment. Anyway, yeah, he's scary. He scares me.
I just wonder, I'm sure you totally respected the Arrowsmith, but when Alfresco is translated as Abianto, which I do a little review.
Oh, I didn't write that. I'm the editor. I didn't mess with Bill's translations. Even if I disagreed with them, I worked with Bill, he showed me his translations for about 20 years. But our friendship was based on Montale. And, but I quarreled with him. Everyone quarreled with Bill. But I didn't rewrite his translations.
At a lower level of generality, could you take the last 4 lines of the first stanza of Dora Markus, just those 4 lines, and read the 2 translations out loud? They differ remarkably, and try to help us understand what the different poetic values are in the choices between in the lowland where a listless spring devoid of memory was sinking, and in the wet flats where a sluggish springtime was settling down, unremembering. I'm talking about the first stanza of Dora Markus, lines 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, I'm just looking. I'm just trying to find them. And this.
Yeah. Well, the first line is exactly the same. So Rosanna, you read your 4, I'll read my 4, and then we'll take them apart.
We should have Fausto read them in Italian too. Maybe you should read them first.
First.
Yes.
Don't get anything between the English versions, because that's what I'm
Right. So
Yeah.
Fausto will read it first in Italian, so you can try to see what the 2 translators are responding to.
Poi seguimmo il canale fino alla darsena della città, lucida di fuliggine, nella bassura dove s'affondava una primavera inerte, senza memoria.
Then we followed the canal to the city dock. Oh, that's yours. I'm sorry. That would be fun. How about this? I'll read yours. And
Okay,
you read
yeah,
yours.
that's a good yeah.
I love Jonathan's translations. Then we followed the canal to the city dock, bright with soot, in the lowland where a listless spring, devoid of memory, was sinking.
Then we followed the canal back to the city's inner harbor, shining with soot, in the wet flats where a sluggish springtime was settling down, unremembering. Now, what do you want us to do, Joel? But I'll just talk about how I approached doing it, and Rosanna was there, so I try to keep some sort of relationship to the rhythm of the original, and to try to keep that tension that I was talking about. And some people have criticized my translation for being too condensed, that it needs to open out to be more understandable. But I think whatever I'm doing there is trying to keep close to some sort of rhythmic equivalent. And I don't think Bill was doing that always. What would you say?
That's correct.
Yeah.
What would you say, Rosanna, about that?
Yeah, I'm just looking at these 2. Back to this. Then we followed the canal back to the city's inner harbor, shining with soot, in the wet flats where a sluggish springtime was settling down, unremembering. Well, I think there are powerful cadences in the Arrowsmith translations too, and they're often prompted by his love of Montale's enjambments. Montale sometimes, often very restless with syntax, and would string a clause or a phrase over the end of the line, and there's an unsettlement in that. And I know that Bill Arrowsmith was very keen on preserving those unsettlements. And also, I think he paid a lot of attention to idiom, trying to make an American English that had an idiomatic naturalness. But Jonathan, any good translator does that, and Jonathan does that too. These two, I don't see, I mean, you could go molecule by molecule in these lines we've just read, and you would notice, for instance, in this, it wouldn't be true of all these, comparing Jonathan's and Bill's, but for instance here, in this case, the Italian passage ends senza memoria, without memory, and in this case, Bill kept the architecture of ending the verse paragraph with that same, the notion of unremembering, and Jonathan, following other rhythmic imperatives, starts the line with devoid of memory, was sinking, and ends the paragraph, I think I'm calling the verse paragraph, powerfully on the verb, was sinking. So what you have there is that the two translators have thrown the emphasis in a different place in the line. Both these translators, I think, are profound poetic sensibilities, and because they do, they take what might be called, I mean, are traditionally called, quote, liberties, in order to try to get some poetic value out of it. It might be rhythm, as Jonathan was saying, or it might be squeezing a little vowel play and consonant play. There's a sense of, I think in both these translations, that they're being turned into poems in English, and that's important. So they're not trots exactly, though they're both pretty close semantically. But they're both driven by compositional values that are partly sonic and partly syntactic, rhythmical. But it's an interesting exercise because they're not so different.
I think, you know, let's just look at the Italian, you know, s'affondava, it doesn't end the last line, but it ends the penultimate line. So it is emphasized by Montale, but I don't think you could do it'd be interesting to see if you could do a translation where you had the lines that ended with was sinking and devoid of memory. Yeah. You have to sacrifice one for the other to creating a readable English sentence. So he chose to emphasize the memory issue, and I chose to emphasize the sinking. I mean, that's just one little example of how we made different choices. But I think that's, in a way, that's like a little minute parsing of what doing translation is all about, and why one translator never is happy with the other translator's work.
or may I add, never really happy with your own. I mean, I speak because I'm not only an editor of translation, I do translate other poets myself. I've done it for many, many years. And I think part of the translator's task, to use that famous Benjaminian phrase, is to be miserable, is to feel that you failed. You've always failed. It's just written into the contract.
I wanted to, as I was reading my translation, I thought of things I needed to change. Yeah. And the other thing is, I think the best way of reading a poet in translation is to read multiple translations.
Yes.
Because I think that's true of any great writer. If you read different versions of Proust, you'll know more about Proust than if you just read one, or Tolstoy, or anyone. And that's true of someone like Montale, even more because he's a poet. And so I think that the kind of little comparison we just did now teaches you a lot about what's really going on in the Italian poem that you couldn't know by reading just one version.
Right.
I also, if I could just add, the following, which is that for me, in this beginning of the poem, what has always been very important are, is the verb affondare, to sink, which, as you
Yes.
see, appears in the third line
Yeah.
as well as in the penultimate line. And in this wonderful enjambment, in the third line, rari uomini quasi immorti affondano. I mean, so that the men are sinking, you see, before we get the completion of the meaning. And this is very much about this downward motion, this descent that is very much a leitmotif in Montale's poetry, especially a lot of the earlier poetry, right?
Yeah.
So that to me, anything that maintains that is, in other words, I prefer Jonathan's translation in great part because he is really into the sinking. And whereas I think Arrowsmith is indeed more into the not remembering, which is, very important as well. But because the sinking motif is introduced so early on, and you do in fact repeat the word sink, right? You say in Jonathan's translation, the men sink, and then again at the end of the line, was sinking. So, for my ear and also for my interpretation of the poem, I prefer this version because precisely it translates that sense of
It's very,
descent and sinkingness.
it's interesting though, because of course, if it really meant the men were sinking, it would be saffondavano. Because he's meaning he sinks the nets, but there's a subtextual
There's a
meaning.
subtextual,
Right.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the uomini affondano, so you're waiting,
Right.
what, themselves, or,
the
but
nets.
it's already suggesting that they themselves are sinking. Just as the spring is inerte, right? Everything seems to be sinking, descending.